A Great Argead Saga Alexein, Alexander the Great. Volume 1, Telesias, The War Dance. By Macedonian. Episode 32-2, Arrival of Athenian Fleets. Battle of the Haliacmon, Day 3. The marsh breathed around them, a wet, suffocating gloom that seemed to swallow the very heat from their bodies. The sun remained buried beneath the horizon, though the sky above the reeds was slowly shedding its bruised purple, shifting into a sickly, pre-dawn gray. The boat, a low-slung, rotted vessel they had dragged from the mud, cut through the dark water with barely a ripple. It was silent work. Every oar stroke was a calculated, agonizing effort to avoid the slap of water against wood, a sound that, in the stillness of the marsh, felt like a thunderclap. Philip sat at the stern, his presence a dark, jagged contrast to the hollow exhaustion of the others. He was covered in dried mud and the dark, copper-scented grime of the sanctum, his eyes scanning the reeds with a predatory, sleepless focus. He was the anchor, his breathing a steady, rhythmic pulse that kept the boat from drifting into the panic of the silence. Menelaus sat in the bow, his knees pulled to his chest. He was shivering, his teeth clicking together with a sound like dry bones. Beside him, Valina huddled close, her face buried in her shawl. "Philip," Menelaus whispered, his voice trembling so violently it cracked. He looked back at his brother, needing to see the physical proof that he hadn't died in the shadows. You actually made it." Philip didn't look up from the dark water, his hand resting firmly on the hilt of his blood-stained dagger. "I said I would follow," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to cut through the cold. "And here I am." Archelaus, working the oar beside Philip, let out a long, shuddering breath he seemed to have been holding for hours. His hands were raw, the skin chafed by the rough wood, but the sight of his brother, alive, driven, and unbroken, seemed to pull the fraying ends of his resolve back together. Euryno sat between them, her gaze fixed on the murky water. She reached out, placing a hand on Philip's arm, feeling the rigid, unnatural tension in his muscles. He's barely holding it together, she thought, the realization hitting her with a sharp pang of grief. He sacrificed his childhood in that room to ensure we could reach this boat. "We are children playing at being ghosts," she murmured, the weight of their lineage feeling like a mountain pressing down on the thin planks. "But we are together. That is what matters." "He is our tether," she silently begged the darkness, her heart hammering against her ribs. "As long as he is here, the Argead name survives." Suddenly, a bird shrieked from the reeds, a discordant, jarring sound that cut through the silence like a knife. The group froze, the oars stopping mid-stroke. Philip didn't flinch. He simply shifted his weight, his eyes locking onto the direction of the noise. He leaned in, his voice a quiet command that brooked no debate. "It's only a bird. Keep rowing, eyes forward. If we stop now, the cold will take us, and the shadows will finish the work. We go to the port. We find the ships. We do not look back." The boat slid forward again, a ghost on the dark water, moving toward the faint silvered promise of the horizon. They were shivering, they were terrified, and they were exhausted, but as they rowed, they moved in a single agonizing rhythm, the heartbeat of a line that refused to be severed. The pre-dawn air over the Haliacmon coast was heavy, tasting of brine and an impending, nameless violence. The sun had not yet crested the horizon, leaving the world in a bruised, monochromatic twilight, where the only sounds were the mournful, rhythmic wash of the waves against the rotted pilings and the lonely, piercing cries of seabirds wheeling through the charcoal sky. At the port, General Parmenion stood as still as a carved pillar of stone, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the black water met the bruised sky. Beside him, old Archelaus shifted his weight, his heavy greaves clanking softly against the wet stone, the leather of his cuirass creaking like the hull of a stressed ship. "They are late," old Archelaus muttered, his voice a gravelly rasp that seemed too loud in the dead air. He spat onto the dock, watching the dark liquid vanish into the cracks. "The tide is shifting. If they don't break the horizon soon, the light will betray them to every spy the usurper has left on the coast." Parmenion didn't turn. His gaze remained locked on the shifting shadows of the deep. "They are patient, Archelaus. Iphicrates does not gamble with his hulls, and he certainly does not hurry for the sake of our nerves. He is waiting for the dawn," Parmenion thought, his mind calculating the drift and the wind speed. He knows that in landing under the cover of night is a grave. He wants the sun to witness his arrival, so the usurper knows exactly who has come to dismantle his reign. High above, atop the crumbling watchtower, young Attalus gripped the cold, salt-slick stone battlements until his knuckles turned the color of bone. The biting wind whipped his hair across his face, but he didn't blink. Beside him, Antipater stood with his hands locked firmly behind his back, his posture as rigid and unyielding as the masonry beneath them. They watched the offshore darkness in a silence so profound it felt heavy, a physical weight pressing against their chests. Slowly, the silhouettes of the Athenian fleet emerged, a forest of masts cutting into the gloom like jagged teeth, creeping toward the harbor with the deliberate predatory grace of sharks scenting blood in the surf. They are coming, Antipater thought, his heart hammering a steady, rhythmic beat against his ribs. The chess pieces are finally moving into the center of the board. Young Attalus squinted, his eyes darting from mast to mast, counting the dark shapes as they rose and fell with the swell. His throat went dry. "Look at them," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant roar of the surf. "They don't even have their lanterns lit. They're ghosts in the water." But, Antipater, look at the spread. The number of hulls, it's so low. If that is the entirety of Iphicrates' strength, how does he expect to hold the coast, let alone march on the city? Antipater's expression remained a frozen mask, though his eyes burned with a cold analytical fire as he surveyed the sparse line of ships. He searched for the trailing transports, the telltale shadows of a larger host, but the horizon remained stubbornly empty. "A dangerous question, boy," Antipater murmured, his voice tight. "Either Iphicrates has brought a surgical force, a blade meant to strike the heart rather than an army to grind against the gates, or his remaining ships are lagging far behind. If he intends to fight a war with that handful of triremes, then he is either a genius or a madman." Suddenly, the gloom further out at sea began to churn. Another series of silhouettes broke the surface of the horizon, far larger and more imposing than the first. These were heavy-timbered triremes and deep-bellied troop transports, looming like leviathans in the gray light of dawn. As the two fleets diverged, the smaller, faster squadron carved a path directly toward the harbor, while the massive second fleet altered course, angling sharply to hit the open coast. A flicker of respect touched Antipater's eyes. "Clever move," he breathed, the words carrying the weight of a hard-won realization. "The port is a feint, a lure to draw the usurper's focus to the docks. He's splitting the enemy's attention, forcing them to choose between guarding the city walls or rushing to the shore to stop the landing. He isn't just bringing men, Attalus. He's bringing a siege." At the city gates, Ismenias and his Theban vanguard stood in grim, disciplined ranks. They were the custodians of this chaos, their spears bristling like a hedge of iron. They waited for the command to march, their breath hitching in the cold morning air as they watched the horizon. "We are the anvil," Ismenias thought, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. "Let the Athenians be the hammer." Offshore, the main body of Iphicrates' fleet, 2/3 of his total force, began to drag, their speeds bleeding away as they drifted in a holding pattern. They were waiting, a coiled spring of wood and bronze, biding their time for the perfect moment to unleash their landing parties. Then the world began to bleed color. The purple horizon ignited into a vibrant, molten orange. As the sun surged upward, the sea transformed. The dark, brooding expanse exploded into a blinding field of silvery, dancing sparks. It was a beautiful, quiet morning, the kind that felt like an insult to the slaughter waiting in the wings. Pausanias crouched in the shadows of an abandoned administrative hall near the city's edge, his lungs burning with the acrid stench of smoke and wet stone. He was no longer in the palace. That seat of power had been swallowed by the uprising hours ago. Now he was a ghost in his own capital, pinned between the surging loyalist mobs and the advancing Theban vanguard. He pressed his back against a crumbling pillar, his brow slick with cold, greasy sweat. Through a narrow arrow slit in the masonry, he stared out at the distant, shimmering masts of the Athenian fleet. "Are they going to land?" he wondered, his heart hammering against his ribs in a wild, uneven rhythm. "Or are they waiting for me to break first?" His gaze flickered toward the dark entryway, a hollow, frantic look of betrayal. The assassins he had dispatched to the sanctum, those cold, professional blades meant to sever the Argead line once and for all, had never returned. The silence from the sanctum was absolute. a void where there should have been the heavy, satisfying thump of royal heads. They failed, he realized, the thought landing with the hollow weight of a tombstone. The princes, they still draw breath. The realization turned his blood to slush. If the boys had slipped the noose, then the entire foundation of his coup had fractured. He wasn't just a usurper anymore. He was a man living on borrowed time, a target with a name the commoners were now screaming in the streets. The city felt as if it were physically pressing inward, narrowing his world to the suffocating confines of this nameless rotting room. He didn't need a scout to tell him the truth. The distant rhythmic thunder of Theban boots on the cobblestones told him everything. He knew the gates had been reclaimed. He could hear the growing, terrifying roar of the citizens in the streets, a sound not of celebration for a king, but of a mob baying for a usurper's head. He knew Parmenion, and those damn Thebans were already tightening the net. The coast was no longer his sanctuary. It was a distant theater of war he was now cut off from by the collapse of his own authority. He leaned his forehead against the freezing stone, his reflection ghostly in the gloom of the shadows. The dilemma clawed at him, a serrated blade against his throat. If I break and try to run for the coast, I'm a fugitive hunted by my own subjects. If I stay here, hiding in the dark, I'm simply waiting for the inevitable. Either way, the crown is gone, and I'm losing my head. The marshy darkness finally gave way to the gray, translucent light of dawn. As the boat slid out of the reeds and into the open channel, the distant sound of rhythmic rowing, too heavy, too disciplined for the usurper's patrols, echoed across the water. Out of the morning mist, 3 sleek, dark silhouettes materialized. They were galleys, their hulls cutting the water with a speed that made the prince's rotted vessel feel like a stagnant log. "Look," Archelaus hissed, his voice raw with sudden, overwhelming relief. From the lead galley, voice boomed across the water, carrying the unmistakable authority of a commander. It wasn't the guttural, menacing tone of an assassin, but the crisp, disciplined shout of a soldier. "Identify yourselves. By the gods, speak." Philip stood up in the boat, his mud-caked frame silhouetted against the rising sun. He didn't cower. He threw his head back, his voice cutting through the damp air with a defiant, iron strength. "I am Prince Philip. With me are the heirs of the Argead line. Identify yourselves or stand aside." The galleys pivoted, closing the distance in seconds. As they drew alongside, the light caught the crests on their helms, the familiar, proud markings of the loyalist vanguard. The men on deck erupted into a cheer that shook the morning stillness. A grizzled officer stepped to the rail of the lead ship, his face creased with a mixture of shock and profound reverence. He dropped to one knee, the movement echoing across the deck. "My princes, we have been searching these marshes since the bells rang. By the grace of the gods, you live," the officer signaled his men, who lowered a boarding ladder with practiced, frantic efficiency. "We have orders from General Parmenion. We are to escort you to the port immediately. The generals are already moving to secure the docks. Iphicrates' Athenian fleet is signaled to dock within the hour." Philip turned to his brothers and sisters. He saw the shivering finally begin to subside, replaced by a dawning, exhausted realization that they had survived the night. "We are moving," Philip commanded, his voice no longer just a rasp of desperation, but the steady tone of a leader. He looked at the loyalist officer. "Escort us to the generals. The usurper still draws breath in the city, but the port is ours. Let us go and finish this." As they climbed the ladder, leaving the rotted boat and the horrors of the marsh behind, the first rays of the true sun finally crested the horizon, turning the sea into a blinding silver field of light. They were safe, they were found, and for the first time in their lives, they were no longer being hunted. They were the ones coming home to reclaim the throne. Back at the bustling harbor, the final third of the fleet broke formation, their heavy keels shearing through the calm water before biting deep into the reinforced stone of the docks, with a shuddering, metallic groan. The harbor master's chains rattled as the Athenian ships surged into their berths, locking into place with the precision of a closing lock. As the heavy wooden ramps crashed down onto the stone quay with a resounding hollow thud, Iphicrates stepped onto the Macedonian port. He moved with the ease of a man who owned the horizon, his cloak snapping in the rising wind as his boot heels rang out against the paved harbor floor, marking the absolute end of Macedonian sovereignty over their own gates. Parmenion and old Attalus moved forward to meet him. the meeting of two worlds, one of crumbling dynastic ambition, the other of Athenian precision. Old Attalus squinted at the Athenian general, his hand resting habitually on the hilt of his sword. He didn't care for the polished armor or the calculated arrogance of these city-bred soldiers. "You're late, Iphicrates," the old man growled, his voice a low, gravelly friction. "Pella has been bleeding while you were busy counting your hulls." Iphicrates didn't blink, his eyes scanning the shoreline with the detachment of a surveyor. "A war is not won by the speed of a man's pulse, Attalus. It is won by the weight of his steel. I am here, and I have brought the storm." Parmenion stepped between them, his posture unflinching. "General," Parmenion said, his voice echoing over the gentle, rhythmic lap of the tide. "The storm is arriving. I trust you are prepared for the thunder." Iphicrates looked toward the city, toward the dark, smoldering silhouette of Pella, his face unreadable. "I have never been much for weather, Parmenion. I prefer to settle things before the rain starts." Just then, the sound of hoofbeats and the clatter of gear broke the morning's tension. A detachment of the loyalist vanguard emerged from the mist, their horses lathered and panting. In the center of the formation, mounted on a nervous bay stallion, sat Philip. Behind him, the others were huddled on the back of supply wagons, pale, hollow-eyed, and covered in the filth of the marshes. Old Attalus gasped, his hand dropping from his sword to his chest, his grizzled face crumpling. "By the gods, the line lives." Philip reined his horse in hard, nearly colliding with Parmenion. He slid from the saddle, his boots clattering against the solid, salt-slick stone of the quay. He looked exhausted, his face a mask of grime and dried blood. But as he stood before the Athenian general amidst the bustling, wood and stone labyrinth of the harbor, he straightened, his chin lifting in a gesture that was unmistakably regal. Around them, the port was a frantic tapestry of conquest. Athenian triremes were wedge-tied into the docks, their massive hulls groaning against the stone pilings, while the air filled with the shouted orders of bosuns and the rhythmic, heavy tramp of hoplites marching off the quays and into the city streets. The harbor, once the proud threshold of the Macedonian crown, had been transformed into the throat of an Athenian beast. Philip ignored the chaos of the unloading supplies and the sight of Athenian soldiers securing the cranes and storehouses. His focus remained locked on Iphicrates, his eyes tracing the line of ships, vessels built from his own forests, now serving the very power that had seized his gate. "General Iphicrates," Philip said, his voice raspy but resonant. "I hope you have enough steel for all of us. Because the usurper is still breathing in that city, and I intend to see him silenced before the sun reaches its zenith." Parmenion looked at the young prince, the mud-stained, sharp-eyed boy who had dragged his siblings through the rot of the marshes, and for the first time he saw not a child but a king. He bowed, a low, sweeping motion of deep respect. "The vanguard is yours, my prince," Parmenion stated, gesturing toward the Athenian halls. "And I suspect the general is more than eager to show you how Athens settles a debt." Iphicrates studied Philip, his gaze raking over the boy's mud-stained tunic, and the dried, crusty blood on his hands. The Athenian general's initial arrogance evaporated, replaced by the sharp electric interest of a veteran watching a predator emerge from a cub's skin. "The boy has the look of a wolf," Iphicrates remarked, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly tone that carried no mockery, only recognition. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the looming silhouettes of the Athenian triremes. "Parmenion, alert the troops. We march within the hour. If the prince wants his city back, we shall give it to him in ash." Philip didn't flinch at the grim prospect. Ash is better than chains, he thought, the cold fury in his chest steadying his trembling hands. Let him burn then. I want him to know that when he looked for an easy grave, he found a war instead. Behind him, his siblings stood in a ragged, silent row. Archelaus, his hand still tied on his dagger, watched Iphicrates with guarded suspicion. He speaks of ash so easily, Archelaus mused, his own heart still echoing with the terror of the marsh. Does he know we are the ones who must live among the ruins he leaves behind? Argead stood a step back, his eyes fixed on the Athenian fleet, with a mixture of awe and residual horror. His hands were still trembling, the phantom sensation of the assassin's blood staining his palms. A war, he thought, swallowing hard. I thought we were just trying to survive the night, but now Philip speaks of burning cities. Menelaus, Urano, and Valina, huddled close together, a fragile knot of survivors. Menelaus watched Philip really watched him, and felt a strange, jarring divide in his chest. That is my brother. Yet he looks like a stranger, he thought. He wears the look of the hunt on his face. Euryno squeezed Valina's hand, her eyes tracing the lines of the Athenian ships. We are being traded, she realized, a cold shiver running through her despite the morning sun. We escaped the knife only to be cast into the fire. Beside her, Valina looked at the horizon, her face pale and vacant. Whatever happens, Valina thought, clinging to the only constant she had left, we are together. As long as we don't look back. Philip didn't turn to look at them. He felt their eyes, their fear, and the crushing expectation of their future on his back. But he kept his gaze fixed on the enemy's horizon. I am not just the wolf, he whispered to himself. I am the wall. Iphicrates turned back to the sea, pointing toward the dark shapes bobbing in the morning mist. Our main force, 2/3 of the fleet, is holding station offshore, waiting for the signal. We must make the landing look like a tidal wave. I want them on the sand and steel ready before the usurper can even blink. If we handle this without a stumble, we can crush his coastal line and force him back toward the city walls. Old Attalus stepped forward, his eyes narrowed as he assessed the Athenians' plan. And what are the gates? If Pausanias senses the trap, he'll lock himself behind the Pella walls like a rat in a hole. That is already handled, Parmenion interjected, his voice cool and tactical. Ismenias and the Theban vanguard are holding the perimeter. They are the custodians of the gate. They won't let a single man flee Pella without paying the toll in blood. Philip felt a grim satisfaction tighten in his gut. Athens, Thebes, and Macedonia, he thought, watching the loyalist ranks stiffen with renewed purpose. He wanted to rule a broken kingdom. He'll have to settle for ruling a graveyard. Pausanias is a coward betting on our hesitation, Philip said, his voice ringing with a cold, terrifying clarity that seemed to strip the warmth from the morning air. By the time he sees the Athenian keels striking the sand, the Theban spears bristling at his gates, and our own force snapping shut the vice from the coast, he will be a trapped animal. He'll look for a way to break contact, to retreat and regroup for a rematch. But we will not grant him the mercy of a breath, let alone the time to reorganize. Iphicrates let out a sharp, jagged laugh, a sound like iron shards grating against a whetstone. A rematch? I think not, Prince. When we finish this, there won't be enough of his rabble left to hold a dagger, let alone a battle line. Philip stared toward the city, his fingers rhythmically flexing against the worn leather hilt of his blade. Good, he whispered, the single word curdling with a promise of violence. Then let us ensure he spends the remainder of his very short life wishing he had died in the dark. Pausanias gripped the edge of the stone table, his knuckles turning wide as the messenger finished. The news hit him with the force of a physical blow. The port was gone, the vanguard was landed. And the city, his seat of power, was entirely in the hands of the royalists. The city is gone, he thought, the realization ringing hollow in his chest. If I stay within these walls, I'm not a king. I'm a trapped rat waiting for the final snap of the wire. He stared at the maps, the routes he had once planned for conquest, now mocking him as paths for a desperate retreat. He had nowhere left to hide. The people were in an open rage, the Thebans were holding the gates, and Iphicrates' fleet was disgorging fresh, disciplined steel onto the shore. They don't want a battle, Pausanias whispered, his voice trembling with a sudden, sharp clarity. They want an execution. He stood straighter, forcing the tremors from his hands. The city was a death trap now. To linger was to invite the axe. Forget the city, he barked, his voice sharpening with a frantic, renewed desperation. We are already compromised. Pull the rear guard back, not to the ruins, but to the northern passes. We break toward the foothills. We don't engage the Thebans, and we don't look back at Pella. If we are to survive, we leave this grave behind and pray we can find a foothold in the hinterlands before Iphicrates hunts us down. But even as he gave the order, the ground beneath his feet shuddered with the unmistakable rhythm of marching boots. The roar of the city, a sound of a people who had finally reclaimed their home, was no longer just an echo. It was a wall of sound pressing against his senses. The retreat would never happen. The heavy thud of shields striking shields shattered the air, followed by the terrifying synchronized battle cry of the Theban vanguard. They were here. The lull Pausanias had gambled on was nothing more than the sharpening of the blade. The wolves had not been waiting to hunt him in the hills. They had tracked him to the very threshold of his hiding place, cornering him like a rat in the dark. He looked out the narrow slit of his sanctuary to see the Athenian banners snapping in the wind, a forest of iron moving with the cold, predatory grace of a storm. He had lost his throne and his city, but as the first splintering crash of the front door being hammered down echoed through the hall, he realized he had lost his future too. The silence on the beach was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical crunch of Athenian boots on wet sand. Parmenion stood at the water's edge, his gaze fixed on the dense, brooding tree line where Pausanias' men had vanished. He is not running, Parmenion thought, his hand tightening on the grip of his xiphus. He is coiling. He knows the geography better than we do. Iphicrates, he said, his voice low and tactical. He's drawn us out of the city and into the wild. He's looking to turn the Haliacmon into a slaughterhouse. Iphicrates didn't turn his head, his eyes scanning the horizon where the last of the Athenian sails were docking. Let him have his terrain, the general replied, his voice a cold, measured rasp. Ground is only as strong as the man standing on it, and Pausanias is a man running on fear and borrowed time. He thinks he's leading us into a trap. He's really just leading us to the place where we bury his ambitions for good. Deep within the tree line, hidden by the thick veil of pine and shadow, Pausanias leaned against an ancient oak, his lungs burning. He watched the beach through a gap in the brush, seeing the flash of bronze and the organized terror of the Athenian landing. They are precise, yes, he thought, his heart drumming a frantic, uneven rhythm against his ribs. But they are overconfident. He wiped a smear of grit from his brow, his hands finally ceasing their tremor. He looked at his gathered officers, men who looked as hollow and desperate as he felt. Let them land, he whispered, a grim, jagged smile touching his lips. Let them fill their lungs with the salt of the coast. By the time they reach the Haliacmon, they'll be tired, exposed, and far from their precious ships. My lord, one of his captains breathed, his voice tight with terror. If we fail at the river, there is nowhere left to run. Pausanias turned his gaze toward the river valley ahead, his expression hardening into a mask of cold, tactical malice. Then we don't fail, he thought, the weight of the coming slaughter settling in his gut like lead. We turn the river red and we make them pay for every inch of sand they stole today. The horizon was no longer a simple division between sea and sky. It had become a rhythmic, heaving pulse of timber and bronze. As the first wave of ships anchored themselves into the surf, solidifying the beachhead, the sea beyond erupted with the approach of the main fleet. A second wave crested the horizon, followed by a third, then a fourth, an endless, interlocking chain of triremes that churned the turquoise water into a violent, frothing sprawl of salt-sprayed white. From the perspective of the heavens, the scene was a masterpiece of lethal geometry. The ships moved with the coordinated intelligence of a school of predatory fish, their bronze-tipped rams cutting through the waves like obsidian shards. The sunlight, refracted through the mist of the churning wake, painted the water in dazzling, iridescent streaks of gold and bruised indigo. The fleet did not merely sail, it colonized the ocean, a massive shifting carpet of polished cedar and taut linen that seemed to draw the very energy out of the horizon. Yet there was a bitter irony in the majesty of the sight. Those very hulls, glistening with salt and Athenian craft, were fashioned from the dense, ancient Macedonian timber that had once belonged to the crown. The great oaks and sturdy pines of the Macedonian highlands, harvested by Athenian engineers and shaped by their shipwrights, had been turned against their own soil. A wooden skeleton of the nation's own strength, now delivering its conquest. This was the legendary naval might of Athens manifest, a power forged in the fire of Salamis and honed through decades of maritime dominance. They were the masters of the wine-dark sea, an iron-fisted hegemony that had once dictated the fate of empires with a single rotation of their oars. To witness this arrival was to see the very soul of the Athenian thalassocracy, a cold, unparalleled precision that turned the chaotic expanse of the sea into a calculated instrument of war. Their ships were not merely vessels. They were extensions of a city that breathed, thought, and conquered through the rhythm of the waves. The landing was a masterpiece of controlled violence. As the ships neared the shore, the view from above revealed the sheer scale of the displacement. The triremes formed a colossal crescent, their oars, hundreds of ashwood blades working in perfect, mechanical synchronicity, beating the water with a sound like a giant's heartbeat. With a synchronized heave, the crews drove the prows into the shallows, the grinding of hulls against sand echoing like the baring of teeth. Ramps crashed down simultaneously along the length of the crescent bay, and from the gaping maws of the ships, the Athenian war machine poured out. It was a breathtaking, terrifying transformation of the coast. Where there had been empty, wind-swept sand moments before, there was now a living mosaic of iron. Thousands of hoplites stepped into the surf, their crimson tunics vibrant against the pale shoreline. Sunlight caught the polished greaves and breastplates, turning the beach into a shimmering, undulating field of gold that seemed to stretch toward the very limits of the bay. From the sky, the beach appeared as an anvil being struck by the gods, the sunlight catching the glint of thousands of spear tips in a rhythmic, blinding flash that signaled the end of one era and the violent, clattering birth of another. The air grew thick with the sound of thousands of sandals hitting the earth in unison, a low tectonic vibration that silenced the gulls and made the very atmosphere hum with the weight of the arriving iron. Behind the heavy infantry, supply wagons and siege engines emerged, domesticating the wild coast into a staging ground for absolute conquest. Old Attalus stood at the shoreline, his calloused hand shielding his eyes. He breathed in the salt spray and the scent of oil and sweat. The Titan of the sea has come to visit, he mused, a grim smirk creasing his weather-beaten face. This is not just an army. This is the wrath of Poseidon himself, forged in cedar and bronze. Near him, Antipater adjusted his cloak, his eyes sharp and analytical as he tracked the deployment. He was not a man given to awe, but he felt the ground tremble beneath the boots of the Theban elite. Beside him, young Attalus stood with his mouth slightly agape, mesmerized by the sheer, terrifying fluidity of the Athenian movement. I have read of such things in the scrolls, the younger man thought, his pulse racing, but to see the sea boil with bronze, it is as if the gods have chosen their side. The sight of the Athenian fleet, that immense, churning master of the waves, struck a discordant note in Ismenias's mind. As he watched the triremes disgorge their cargo, he couldn't help but think of Epaminondas, his gaze fixed not on the horizon, but on the potential for Thebes to mirror this very spectacle. He's obsessed with this, Ismenias thought, his eyes tracking the way the Athenian hulls cut the water with effortless, predatory grace. Epaminondas looks at the sea and does not see an alley. He sees a missing limb of our own ambition. Ismenias knew his general's mind better than most. He had sat through the long shadowed meetings in Thebes, where Epaminondas spoke of the wooden walls, not as an Athenian monopoly, but as an inevitable necessity for any power that dared to call itself an empire. He watches the Athenians, and he dreams of a Theban harbor brimming with our own ships, Ismenias mused, a grim understanding settling over him. He believes that until we have our own tide of bronze and cedar, we are merely guests in this war. The Athenian soldiers were magnificent, yes, a display of naval supremacy that had defined the Mediterranean for a century, but to Ismenias, they were a reminder of the gap between the world as it was and the world Epaminondas was desperate to build. He would hate this, Ismenias realized, a sharp analytical edge to his thoughts. He would watch this arrival and see only the work he has yet to finish. He doesn't want their help, he wants their power. He wants to drag Thebes out of the dust and onto the waves. He shifted his grip on his sword, the metallic clatter echoing the rhythmic beat of the Athenian oars. He will build them, Ismenias thought, a quiet resolve hardening his expression. Whatever the cost, he will make the sea bow to Thebes, just as he has made the land bow to our spears. Philip stood apart, an island of stillness in the middle of the beautiful, frantic geometry of the deployment. He watched the lines form, straight, impenetrable, and radiating, a cold, clinical power that dwarfed the rugged, messy chaos of the distant tree line. He's watching us, isn't he? Philip asked, not looking at Parmenion. His eyes were fixed on the rhythmic flow of the soldiers, a force that looked less like a collection of men and more like an unstoppable tide of bronze. Parmenion stepped closer, his gaze sweeping over the assembled commanders and the vast, glistening expanse of the beach. He is, Parmenion answered, his hand resting firmly on the pommel of his sword. Every man here, from the oldest veteran to the youngest Theban, is holding his breath. Pausanias is hiding in those woods, and he is likely counting every shield. Trying to calculate the weight of his own funeral, Antipater stepped forward, his voice cutting through the hum of the deployment. The river Haliacmon will be the altar, my prince. We have the sea at our backs and the storm in our hands. Good, Philip said, turning toward the path leading to the river. The sunlight glinted off the hilt of his dagger as he took his first step toward the Haliacmon. Then he'll have a front row seat to his own end. Behind them, the fleet continued to disgorge its contents, the rhythmic thunder of the landing creating a drumbeat of destiny that rolled across the dunes and into the dark, silent forest where Pausanias waited. The beach was no longer just a shore. It was the anvil upon which the fate of Macedonia was being struck, and the Titan had finally arrived to claim its due. To be continued in episode 33, Athenian Envoy's Gambit. Watch and listen now. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Telesias Playlist. Bookmark Volume 1, Divine Oracle Playlist. Join the Vanguard. A new episode drops every single day until the epic conclusion of Volume 1. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Subscribe to follow the bloody rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.